Is it possible to work out what the rarest individual Pokemon is? No. I know that's not a satisfying answer, but let's just cut right to the chase. In order to work out the single most unique Pokemon that exists, I would somehow need knowledge of every individual Pokemon that has ever been caught before. According to sales figures from 2024, mainline Pokemon games have sold over 325 million copies worldwide. If I was to somehow buy up every single one and comb through the save files, I don't think it would be possible in my lifetime. If we assume that each player catches an average of just 10 Pokemon throughout the course of their game, that still leaves 3 billion Pokemon to sort through. And at a very generous rate of 1 per second, that's going to take about 95 years of my life. And the worst part of all, most of them would probably be unique. To take a step back, this video obviously wouldn't exist if the answer was just a flat no. Even if I can't find a definitive answer, I still think there's layers to this question that are worth exploring. I've been asked this question before in relation to shiny Pokemon, and I think I gave it a pretty good shot by figuring out which Pokemon could only be hunted with the lowest odds and the slowest methods. But at its core, I don't think the rarest Pokemon is something that can ever truly be answered, because even figuring out how to interpret the question is a challenge all on its own. So I wanted to dive into what we can take into account when deciding what makes a Pokemon unique. If you simply look at species, there are currently 1,025 unique Pokemon. By taking forms into account, that number goes up to around 1,338, not counting temporary transformations like Mega Evolutions or Zygarde's complete form. And if we include visible gender differences, we can push that number up by 101. So you could say your Pokemon is 1 in 1,439 and call it a day. But surely some species of Pokemon are rarer than others, right? When you start a playthrough of Fire Red or Leaf Green, you're free to catch as many Rattata as you like, but you only get one Charmander, Bulbasaur or Squirtle, and to get more you have to go out of your way to breed for them in the postgame. But then you also have to consider exactly how many times are people catching common Pokemon like Pidgey and Bidoof in comparison to more rare and powerful Pokemon. You only get one Mewtwo per game, so it's fair to assume that most players are going to make sure they catch them. But in the case of extremely common Pokemon, most players will probably only catch one if they're trying to complete their Pokédex. After all, there's literally an unlimited supply of Pidgey, so there's no real rush. Continuing that train of thought to the next logical station, can we even say for certain whether Pokemon of a similar rarity would have been captured a similar amount of times? I would hazard a guess that there's probably more Litten and Rowlet in the world than Poplio, due to the fact that Rowlet has been a starter in one extra game, and Incineroar is a valuable competitive Pokemon, so many players would have been breeding for Litten with good IVs since Generation 7. Zangoose and Seviper are also often paired together as counterparts, but Seviper was featured in Outbreaks for the Year of the Snake celebrations back in January, meaning there might be slightly more Seviper than Zangoose. At the end of the day, it's impossible to know for certain how many times a specific Pokemon has been caught in the history of the franchise, but that information does exist out there somewhere, at least for Scarlet and Violet. It turns out those games keep track of many different stats, which Game Freak also has access to. This includes people's favourite sandwich toppings, what TMs they craft, their favourite NPCs to invite to the clubhouse, and even how many Pokemon they catch. They didn't release any exact figures, and this is only for Generation 9, but they did reveal the 3 most commonly caught Pokemon of each type. Anyway, since we can't even begin to estimate how many Pokemon exist in the whole world, or how many there are of each species, the next best thing we can do is figure out how unique your individual Pokemon is when compared against others of the same kind. To start small, let's take a look at gender. A majority of Pokemon have an equal chance of being either male or female, with 155 Pokemon classified as gender unknown. But there are also some species where the chance of getting a male or female is only 24 or 12.5%. Interestingly, female Pokemon are slightly less common overall if you look at the gender ratios. There are 37 Pokemon that are always female, 25 that have a 1 in 4 chance of being male, and only 2 that have a ratio of 7 females to 1 male, that being Litleo and its evolution Pyroar. Meanwhile, there's 26 Pokemon that are always male, 19 that have a 1 in 4 chance of being female, and 131 where females are only 1 in 8. Genders and breeding mechanics were first added in Generation 2, and it's theorized that this gender ratio was given to Pokemon that they wanted to be harder to obtain, since the species of an egg is decided by the female parent. The 7:1 male to female ratio was given to all starter Pokemon, along with other rare and one-off encounters like Eevee, Snorlax, Togepi, and the fossils, ensuring that even if you figured out how breeding works, it wouldn't be too easy to hatch a bunch of these rare Pokemon to trade with your friends. Or at least, it would be if you didn't know about Ditto. Even after breeding mechanics became more common knowledge, this gender ratio became a tradition for starters and other rare gift Pokemon like Zorua, Riolu, and future fossil Pokemon, with the exception of Galar's hybrids. Salander and Combi also got this ratio to make their female-only evolutions slightly harder to obtain. So if you were lucky enough to catch a female Pokemon with a 7:1 ratio of male to female, that means your Pokemon is 1 in 8. For the sake of visualization, let's just say it's a female Totodile. Not a bad start, although some of these rarer gender Pokemon can be made slightly more common in generations 4 to 8. By using a male Pokemon with the ability Cute Charm in the front of your party, you have a 66% chance of a wild Pokemon's gender being re-rolled as female, as long as it isn't one that's all male or gender unknown. The same also works when using a female Pokemon with Cute Charm, letting you increase the chance of finding a male Litleo or other majority female species. Next we can take a look at natures. There are 25 unique natures, although 5 of them have the same neutral effect on a Pokemon's stats, and each one has an equal chance of appearing on a wild Pokemon. So that immediately makes your Pokemon 1 out of 25 in terms of how unique they are, at least in theory. In practice, several natures are going to be a lot more common than others, since they have competitive benefits. Natures that reduce attack or special attack are generally the most common, since a Pokemon normally only ever needs to be using one offensive stat, so it might as well reduce the one that it isn't using in exchange for more speed, durability, or attack power. Adamant, Modest, Jolly, and Timid are probably the 4 most common natures, although Brave, Relaxed, Quiet, and Sassy are also used on Trick Room teams to make Pokemon slower. Thankfully, due to the addition of Nature Mints, it's now possible to get the mechanical effect of any nature regardless of your Pokemon's original one, so the need to use Synchronize or Everstone breeding to guarantee a Pokemon's nature is now much less important than it used to be. So for the sake of general statistics, we can assume natures are going to appear at roughly the same rate. Abilities are another mechanical factor that can be taken into account, although there are many Pokemon that only ever have one ability. For those that have 2 normal abilities, it's an equal chance to have one or the other, or in other words, a 1 in 2 probability. And for hidden abilities, it will depend on exactly how they were encountered. Some Pokemon, such as those from the Dream Radar, Hidden Grottos, and the Virtual Console games, are guaranteed to have hidden abilities if possible. And several other methods, like Horde Encounters and SOS Chains, have a small chance to generate Pokemon with their hidden abilities. In terms of modern Pokemon though, abilities are also no longer a fixed quality, with ability capsules and ability patches allowing you to freely change them to suit your needs. Similar to natures, there is also another flavor aspect that describes the behavior of your Pokemon. Starting in Generation 4, your Pokemon is also given a characteristic on its summary screen, which is assigned based on the value and stat of their highest IV. If their strongest IV is in speed, your Pokemon might be impetuous and silly or quick to flee, and if its highest is in defense, it might have good endurance or a sturdy body. If the highest IV is a tie between multiple stats, then it's randomized between them using the Pokemon's Encryption constant, a piece of the Pokemon's data that I'll come back to later. There are 30 different characteristics in total, so the odds of a Pokemon having the same nature and characteristic as yours is theoretically 1 in 750. And in the case of our hypothetical female Totodile, let's imagine she's mild-natured and her characteristic is quick-tempered. By adding the 1 in 8 gender odds, that's now a 1 in 6,000 Pokemon. If you take IVs directly into account, it immediately explodes the total number of possible unique Pokemon. Each Pokemon has 6 IV stats, and each one has 32 possible values, which means the chances of getting a Pokemon with any given combination of IVs is 1 in 32 to the power of 6, or 1 in 1,073,741,824, although that assumes your chance of getting any value for an IV is equal, which it isn't. If any of your Pokemon's IVs are the maximum of 31, that's generally ideal from a competitive standpoint, but it also makes it less unique. Even if we don't count all the Pokemon that have been bred for competitive use with perfect stats, some types of encounters are guaranteed to have Pokemon with a certain amount of perfect IVs. This started in Generation 6, and applies to mainly legendary Pokemon, but it also affects Pokemon caught in Terra Raids, Max Raid Battles, SOS Chains, the Friend Safari, Ultra Wormholes, and more. Not to mention you can use bottle caps to set any IV to a functional value of 31, meaning IVs are no longer the immutable characteristic that they were prior to Generation 7. So for the sake of keeping this number from getting too crazy just yet, we'll just ignore IVs for now. Using bottle caps won't change your Pokemon's characteristic, but the fact that several encounter methods force a Pokemon to be generated with maximum IVs in one or more stats does mean that the characteristics assigned to an IV of 31 are going to be vastly more common, namely taking plenty of siestas, thrashing about, being mischievous, alert to sounds, somewhat vain, and capable of taking hits. Generation 8 added another layer of personality and uniqueness to certain Pokemon through the introduction of marks. Pokemon caught in the wild in either Sword or Shield or Scarlet and Violet have a small chance of having a mark, which can be used to give them a unique title in battle. Scarlet and Violet is the best place to hunt for marks, as you can increase your chances with both the Mark Charm and Title Power 3 sandwiches. With both of these bonuses, our chance of getting a weather-based or time-based mark is around 1 in 10. The odds of getting the Destiny mark is 1 in 5 if it's your birthday, and the erroneously named Uncommon mark is 1 in 9.5. The only marks you can't get in Scarlet and Violet are the Dry mark, the Fishing mark, and the Curry Connoisseur. With just the Mark charm, the Dry Mark is 1 in 18 during harsh sunny weather, and the Fishing Mark is 1 in 9.6 for, as you might guess, Pokemon caught by fishing. Meanwhile, the Curry Mark is a guaranteed chance to appear on wild Pokemon that show up at your campsite after making a curry. Much like the Uncommon Mark, the Rare Mark is also somewhat misnamed. While it is much harder to find at a maximum chance of 1 in 189, it's not actually the rarest mark. The chance for a wild Pokemon to be given a personality mark is 10 times more common than one being given the rare mark, but when that happens, the game then picks one of the 28 different personality marks at random, which means if you're looking for a specific personality, the chance of one spawning is almost 3 times lower at 1 in 529. There have been outbreak events in the past that have boosted the chance of Pokemon having specific personality marks, or even the rare mark. These outbreak Pokemon first have a flat 5% chance of being given an event boosted mark before going through the normal odds of rolling for any other marks instead. But these boosts also only apply to specific Pokemon, and they can only be hunted if you went online during the event period. While you can't have multiple of these marks on a single Pokemon, there are also 2 other marks that are obtainable independently, although each one is mutually exclusive. If you find a maximum or minimum size Pokemon, you can get the Jumbo or Teensy marks by showing them to this NPC in Mesagoza. Without any kind of boosts, the odds of this happening naturally are 1 in 16,512, 4 times rarer than finding a random full odds shiny in this generation. But with the help of meal powers, this can go as high as 1 in 64, and for wild Tera Pokemon, they naturally have a 1 in 56 chance of being maximum size. So if our hypothetical female Totodile also happened to be minimum size, and was caught with, for example, the Jittery mark, the chances of another starter having the same gender, size, nature, characteristic, and personality mark is now 1 in 203,136,000. Even without taking the gender ratio into account, that's still 1 in 25 million. Maybe now you can see why this question is so impossible to answer, because despite only looking at 5 variables, our number of possible unique Pokemon is now in the hundreds of millions just for a single species. And I haven't even factored in what it would be if we found a shiny. Since this hypothetical Totodile has a personality mark, it would have had to be hunted in Scarlet and Violet, so we can use the best possible shiny odds from the Shiny Charm, a Mass Outbreak, and a Sparkling Power 3 sandwich, which is 1 in 512. So the chance of finding a shiny version of our teensy, anxious, mild, quick-tempered female Totodile is 1 in 104,5,632,000. And of course, there are a few special factors that are unique to individual Pokemon, or only apply to a small number of them. I'm not going to cover all of them in detail, as some of them are fairly easy to work out for yourself, like Minior's 7 colours, but these are some of the more interesting cases. Antique Sinistea was considered to be one of the rarest Pokemon forms for a while, as it only appears around 10% of the time compared to the more common Phony form, as well as being almost impossible to tell apart without close inspection. However, as of the Teal Mask update, it's now possible to find outbreaks that are entirely made up of Antique Sinistea and Artisan Poltergeist, so with a bit of preparation work, it's now fairly trivial to get marked or even shiny ones. When they were first introduced, Flabebe with orange and white flowers were harder to find than ones with red, blue and yellow. Orange flower Flabebe had a 4% encounter rate and white was only 1%. This continued in Sun and Moon, as orange and white were only available through SOS chaining, although much like with Sinistea, all 5 colours now seem to have equal rarity in Scarlet and Violet. The same goes for Vivillon, whose form in Gen 6 was determined by the real-world region of your console, but by connecting to Pokemon Go, you can use postcards from around the world to transform all the wild Vivillon in Paldea into the relevant form. This does still require you to know someone who lives in or has been to a certain part of the world, but it's still doable. And just because I was curious, I looked up all the regions of the world where each form of Vivillon could be found, and then added up the total populations to work out which one had the highest and lowest number of potential Pokemon fans who could trade you their native Vivillon pattern. Thanks to China and India, the regions for Continental and Monsoon were by far the most populated, accounting for 1.4 billion people each, double that of Sandstorm and over a billion more than any other pattern. Meanwhile, Ocean Pattern Vivillon has the smallest total by a wide margin, as it's only available to the populations of Hawaii and Reunion Island. That's not to say that these numbers directly correlate to how easy it is to obtain them though. While I don't want to generalise, I imagine that out of the 118 million people living in Japan with access to the Elegant pattern, you're likely to find a higher percentage of Pokemon fans than, for example, the 128 million people living in Ethiopia with access to the Sandstorm pattern. There's also the matter of the language barrier, as if you ask around for Vivillon patterns in English-speaking communities, there's a good chance you'll find plenty of people with High Plains, Modern and Polar, since those are the ones you can find in America and Canada. And maybe if you're lucky you'll find a few European or Australian patterns like Garden, Meadow and River. However, I do feel confident in saying that the rarest pattern is most likely the Pokeball pattern. This event-exclusive form was only available for a few weeks in 2014 as a mystery gift, and after that it was only released one more time, for a month in 2016 at the Hiroshima Pokemon Center. Fancy Pattern was also exclusive to Mystery Gift for less than a month in 2014, but it's now the default pattern for Vivillon in Paldea when you don't have a postcard to share from Go. With Antique Sinistea no longer on the throne, Family of 3 Mousehold and 3 Segment Dunsparce are currently seen as the pinnacle of rare forms, as Tandemaus and Dunsparce only have a 1% chance of evolving into them. It is slightly easier to get 3 Segment Dunsparce if you have access to older generation games though, as a hardy nature Dunsparce with the ability Serene Grace will have a 50% chance of evolving into the 3 segment form when transferred from generations 3 or 4. This is due to the personality value and the encryption constant, which are a string of numbers in the Pokemon's data that are used for determining certain attributes that make Pokemon unique from one another, and in the case of Tandemaus, Dunsparce, and also Wurmple, it determines what they evolve into. The encryption constant was added in Generation 6, and Pokemon transferred up from Generation 5 are given an encryption constant that is identical to their personality value, and the area of the encryption constant that decides the Dunsparce's form is the same area of the personality value that decides nature and ability in Generations 3 and 4. And one of the 2 values that gives a Pokemon a hardy nature and their first ability is the same values that generates 3 segmented Dunsparce. Since there are 25 different natures and a 50-50 chance of getting either of Dunsparce's abilities, your chance of finding a hardy Serene Grace Dunsparce is about 2%. And with the 50% chance on top, that does add up to an exact 1% chance to find a Dunsparce that will evolve with 3 segments. Or you can use the ability Synchronize in Generation 4, which will give you a 50% chance of wild Pokemon having a certain nature, meaning you should find a 3-segmented Dunsparce in about 8 attempts. And of course, when it comes to talking about unique Pokemon, Spinda is usually the first that comes to mind. Each one has a randomized pattern of 4 spots, and there are 4,294,967,296 different possible combinations. Although some of these configurations will have spots in places that overlap or appear out of frame on Spinda's face, so the actual number of visibly unique patterns is technically lower than this. I wouldn't even begin to know where to start calculating that, so I asked friend of the channel Professor Rex, and he just so happened to be solving this exact problem. He's still working out the precise number, but so far he believes that roughly 15% of those 4 billion patterns are visually identical to at least one other Spinda, so that gives us a ballpark figure of around 3.65 billion unique Spindas. Obviously, if we add those odds to our 1 in 104 billion shiny Totodile, we're going to get an absurdly big number that I can't even begin to put into a frame of reference. But that's forgetting the fact that Spinda has a 50-50 gender ratio, and cannot be caught in either of the games that have personality marks. You can even catch Spinda with higher shiny odds than Generation 9 outbreaks, as Spinda can be SOS chained with 1 in 273 shiny odds. And SOS chaining also has the added effect of giving guaranteed perfect IVs, meaning a Spinda with this shiny rate only has 6 possible characteristics. The ability Synchronize also affects the Pokemon that answer SOS calls, meaning you have a 50% chance of forcing it to be any nature that you want, on top of the usual 1 in 25 chance of it having that nature anyway. The shiny Spinda you get from this SOS chain may have a 1 in 3.6 billion pattern, but with a 1 in 273 shiny, a 1 in 1.9 nature, only a 1 in 6 characteristic, and a 1 in 2 gender, this Spinda is only around 1 in 22 trillion, which is honestly still pretty unique. If you want to play along at home, this should be enough information to calculate the rarity of any of your own Pokemon to the degree that you think is suitable. Complicated math formulas aren't my strong suit, but working out the probability of multiple things happening at once is actually fairly easy when you know the ratios. If the odds of a certain nature is 1 in 25, the odds of a female are 1 in 4, and the odds of a shiny are 1 in 512, you can calculate the total chance by multiplying them all together. 1 in 25 times 1 in 4 times 1 in 512 is 1 in 51,200, so that's the chance of all 3 conditions being met at once. But I suppose I can leave you with one last giant number to wrap your head around, and this might be the final answer for the total number of unique Pokemon. And it involves taking another look at the personality value and the encryption constant. The personality value is a 32-bit integer, meaning it's a string of binary that is 32 digits long. And starting in Generation 3, a Pokemon's individual stats are determined by this value. By using 32 ones and zeros, there are 4,294,967,296 different values that you can make. You might remember this as the number of potential Spinda patterns, and that's because the personality value is broken into 4 pieces, and those are used as coordinates to determine the placement of the 4 spots. This number also accounts for all possible combinations of nature, ability, and gender, so it could be argued that a single Pokemon is simply 1 in 4.29 billion. But in Generation 6, they added another 32-bit integer called the Encryption constant. This effectively acted as an extension of the personality value, and took over some of its functions. And by doubling the length of the integer, they exponentially increased the number of possible values to a massive 18 quintillion, 446 quadrillion, 744 trillion, 73 billion, 709 million, 551,616. Now all we have to do is multiply that by the 1,338 unique Pokemon forms that could theoretically be obtained with any of those 18 quintillion values, and then multiply that by the base shiny rate of 4,096. The encryption constant does determine whether a Pokemon is shiny, but they do it by performing something called an exclusive OR operation using your trainer ID, meaning that any of those quintillion values has a chance to be shiny, depending on the ID of the trainer that catches them. That means, on a technical level, your shiny Pokemon is potentially 1 in 10 septillion. Never let anyone tell you that your shiny Bidoof isn't special. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video, then you already know what you can do. But if you want to support the channel even more, you can now become a channel member and get early access to future uploads like this one.
That was brilliant, Candle Meat. Very much enjoyed.